the flickering light of Asia, or the Assyrian nation and church. The flames which enveloped the world seemed as if they were originally ignited to consume the Assyrian race. Vahil, the independent Nestorians of the mountains, were struggling to extricate themselves from the trap which the Turkish government had laid for their extermination. The Mohammedans of Urmia had secretly planned to perpetrate the same diabolical deed upon the Assyrians of Persia, so long the Russians were in control of the northwestern Persia. They, of course, would not dare to reveal the least indication of an ill feeling toward the Christians. The presence of these Muscovite soldiers in Persia, from the time of their first entry into the country, which was some years before the World War, had steadily and secretly given rise to the temperature of Islam's cauldron of revenge. The overflow had most clearly been concealed and stored up in a fearfully boiling form, to be let loose in some opportune moment. And this moment they knew it was destined to arrive with the fluctuations in the fortunes of the Great War, while the Persian Assyrians remained in total darkness with reference to the progress of the contending armies. The Muslims of Urmia were kept amazingly well informed as to the events that were happening. Through the most wonderful espionage system of the Turkish Revolutionary Committee, the agents and the propagandists of the committee had been cleverly operating the beginning of the war in every known Mohammedan community throughout Asia. The Assyrians, as well as the foreign element in Urmia, comprising some missionary bodies, had pinned their confidence and their faith on the mighty power of the neighboring empire. If there was any fear to be had, that fear arose from the possibilities of the Turkish arms, which of course were considered no match for the Russian forces, or for the military tactics of the Muscovite generals. They also believed that the British expedition in Mesopotamia would compel the Turkish general staff to maintain a strong army in that front, and by doing so Turkey was obliged to weaken the northern armies, and thus making them incapable of an invasion into either Caucasia or northwestern Persia. But when were the morals justified by relying confidently upon the arm of the flesh? This was a new era, a period of mightiest convulsions the earth had ever known. Humanity had been driven into unknown seas. An invisible hand had pressed the button. The wheels of awe-inspiring events were revolving fast. Providence had willed tremendous changes in the political regimes of the nations, just as they were foretold centuries before the infallible prophets of the real king of the earth. The Assyrians of Persia, however, did not feel justified to sit still while another power was shedding blood for the emancipation of the Christians from the bondage of Islam. They accordingly volunteered to take up arms and render all the military assistance they could to the Russian forces in this remote front. The Persian authorities, however, were given to understand that this step was not taken by the Christian subjects as a revolutionary movement against the government, but rather as a measure of self-defense against any possible invasion by the Turks, and also against the freebooting expeditions of the Kurds, who had already commenced to annoy the Christian inhabitants of Urmia. Whether the local authorities were satisfied or not, they accepted the explanation, apparently with goodwill, and of course they did so again from the fear of the Russians. But additional fuel passed now under the cauldron, and Islam's hidden rage registered its highest temperature for a determined and hellish revenge. The line of the Russian operations in the province of Azerbaijan extended at the time as far as the city of Savujbula, some 70 miles from the city of Urmia, and in Urmia itself they maintained a small force of the Cossacks together with a few hundred men of the infantry. In addition to this Urmia contingent, there were other quotas of much larger numbers of troops in Salamas and also in Khoi. Both of these districts are situated immediately north of Urmia. The Russian operations in this front were held in abeyance, pending developments in the direction of Sarikamish, in ancient Armenia, where a large army of the Turks was reported to be moving for the invasion of Caucasia. The Russian forces of Caucasia stationed there to confront these invaders were considered altogether inadequate to cope with the situation. A successful invasion, as contempted by the Turks, would have meant not only the loss of vast areas in southern Russia, but it would also have jeopardized the position of all Russian forces stationed in various centers, in Armenia and in Persia, and have led to their inevitable capture by the enemy. All Russian contingents in Persia, therefore unbeknown to the Assyrians, were ordered to withdraw and retreat toward the Russo-Persian frontier, and remain there indefinitely pending the fortunes of battle, which was soon to rage in Sarikamish. And indeed the fear of a successful Turkish invasion had become so great that many of the Christian inhabitants of Tiflis and the surrounding country had fled further into the interior of Russia. Thus, during the night preceding the 20th day of December 1914, the troops of the Tsar had taken their departure, while the Assyrian soldiers remained still, engaged in heated battles with the Kurds, who seemed to possess a full knowledge of the movement of the Russian forces in Persia. As the sun of the 24th day of December began to smile on the hilltops of the ancient Tabarma, the cauldron of Islam's revenge was ready to overflow with the vengeance of demons. Copies of the proclamation of the Holy War, which were held in abeyance, were now instantly posted in the streets of the city, and before the Russian rear was within a hailing distance from the city, messengers were sent to all the Mohammedan villages, with the joyous news that the day of revenge and massacre had come. The Assyrians of Persia woke up on that fateful morning, stunned with astonishment and paralyzed with fear. Some of their contingents, as already stated, were less than 20 miles from the city, still holding back the inrush of the Kurdish hordes. They were unaware of the retreat of the Russians and of the uprising of the entire Muslim element of the district. Those of the Assyrians, a chosen few who had aspired to be profitable leadership in former days, unmindful of the fate of the people, failed to notify the isolated troops, and mounting their horses, they escaped after the retreating Russians. The Assyrians made up mostly of the young elements of Takya and Ardashir, and the volunteers of the district of Baranduz, which was the farthest from the city toward the south. Now realizing that they also had to extricate themselves from their precarious position, they grasped the situation after several hours of fighting on that fateful morning, which they failed to receive the regular supply of ammunition from the Russian headquarters, and also the assistance which was promised for that day. They retreated inch by inch, so to speak, their face to the enemy. They bravely contested the loss of every new position to which they were steadily falling back. Night came to their rescue. Darkness covered them from the view of the tenacious foe. They gave a sigh of relief as they turned their faces toward the homes and the families they had left behind. But with the fall of the darkness, there loomed up before them another and most terrifying sight. The whole firmament appeared ablaze, and mighty columns of smoke were seen curling upward to the sky. The cauldron had been let loose. Islam's had drawn the sword. The adherents of Muhammad had lightened the torch. In a few hours, the news of the Russian retreat had spread to every Assyrian hamlet and village throughout the districts of Urmia. The fearful news needed no corroboration. The ugly and demoniacal looks on the faces of the Mohammedan neighbors would have sufficed to have apprised them of their awful peril. Bewildered and almost insane with fear, the Christians did not know which way to turn. Some 10 or 12,000 of them, whose villages lay in the path of the retreating Russians, had left their homes and all their possessions, and without provisions for the journey, had started to an unknown destination, following their former protectors. And as they advanced all along the journey, the multitude of the fleeing men and women and little children grew to such proportions that the highway was congested almost to a standstill. The sight was simply frightful. It did not take long before the roads were strewn with these bodies of the dead, and the dying from cold and starvation, for these refugees, in their haste and fear, had not taken with them any coverings. The snow was deep on the ground, and the cold winds of Media appeared to be playing to the tune of Islam's rage. Women gave premature birth to children, and with their newborn babies were left on their beds of snow, to be relieved of their agony by an awful death. Aged men and women stumbled and fell, and there was no helping hand to lift them up. They were hungry and exhausted. Their feet were half frozen, they simply could not move. They sat where they stopped, and they died where they fell. Some of the people who joined the caravan of the refugees, as it approached their villages, ventured to carry with them part of their cattle, to be used as beasts of burden. But soon the carcasses of the oxen and the water buffaloes added to the horror and confusion of the road. It took more than a week for these wretched throngs to reach the boundary line of Persia. But when they put their frozen and blistered feet on the Russian soil, they discovered that nearly 1/3 of their number had perished on the way, and that the total sum of the remainder, as taken by the authorities, was more than 50,000 souls, including the Christians of Salinas and Chio. Shortly after the Russian retreat from Persia, and before the arrival of Marshamun's army, the Persian Assyrians began to flee to protection of the American and the French flags in Urmia, but they were intercepted by the Muslims, who killed hundreds of them and carried their women captives. But now we return to witness the awful tragedy of Urmia. Most of the people of Nazlu district and the country beyond had escaped with the Russians. The vast majorities who dwelled in Urmia and Baranduz and Margaver and Targaver districts had no chance to flee, as the fear of the latter arose mostly from the attitude of the Persian Mohammedans. The first thought that entered into the minds was to leave all their possessions and make a run to the only two centers where they thought they can have protection. These centers were the extensive buildings of the American mission in Urmia and the smaller quarters of the French Lazarist monks. The only hope of the people's salvation was now in those two flags, the Stars and the Stripes, and the tricolored flag of France. But could the people reach there? The flags were waving high in the city where the two mission buildings stood. Driven by the awful fear of the massacre, the trembling throngs took to the roads that fled into those two distant havens. But as they emerged from their homes and villages, they found all their ways intercepted and blocked. They felt as if they had jumped out of a frying pan and fallen into the fire. The inhabitants of some of the nearby villages, situated within a mile or two of the city, and who had first of the Russians' retreat, managed to arrive in the city without much loss. To the larger majorities, however, it would have taken from 2 or 4 hours to make the journey, provided, of course, they continued on their way unhampered and unmolested. But now the whole country around had assumed a terrible aspect. Friends had become foes, and all the highways leading to Urmia city were swarming with the packs of the human wolves. They had come out for revenge, both to kill and to plunder. It was a wintry day, with temperature not far from zero. The fleeing throngs were literally stripped of their entire clothing. Naked women and little girls, 8 and 10 years of age, were subjected to the most revolting outrages. Little children were stabbed with daggers or chopped to pieces by axes before the eyes of their frantic parents. Young virgins were assaulted while their helpless fathers were compelled to witness the hellish crime. Many of these refugees had fled back and sought the shelter of the church edifices, thinking perhaps Islam's passion might balk at the sight of the sacred shrines which its inhabitants were accustomed to revere. But the malignant flood of crime knew no bounds. The Christians' holy Bibles were opened on the pulpits and their pages desecrated by the committal of unmentionable deeds. The houses of Christian worship were first transformed into houses of ill fame, and then turned into human abaters, naked, frozen, wounded, and bleeding, a remnant of the Assyrians, to reach the havens they were so frantically seeking. Had the desire for greed and plunder been forgotten a little longer by these Muslim brutes, perhaps this massacre would have surpassed in violence that of Tamerlane during his invasion of the same lands some centuries before. But as they were all anxious to be the first to enter the homes of Christians for a richer haul of plunder, they deserted the highways and got busy in the villages of their victims. They emptied every home of its entire contents and set the building on fire. Fisk Cemetery for girls before it was destroyed by the Muslims, and where the Assyrian refugees fled, courtesy Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions. 2 or 3 larger towns situated not far from the city. Their inhabitants did not flee. They relied either upon the influence of their Mohammedan landlords or upon the promised protection of their Muslim neighbors who had apparently remained friendly. They, however, suffered more, and they were made to suffer more by those very neighbors. The male population of the towns were brought together and driven during the night to the cemeteries. There the victims were promised immunity from death if they would only disclose their gold and silver. This was a time when the smallest straw seen floating on the rolling waves might be grabbed at as a possible hope of a possible escape from an horrible death. But after the victims had given up all they possessed, they were so brutally murdered that many of them could not be recognized by their wailing relatives. On the heels of this fearful wave, there came another equally as fiendish when the invading Kurds arrived. So far as the plunder was concerned, the latter had come from the gleanings only. But as for the perpetration of the atrocious deeds, there was enough left for them also to quench their thirst for blood and satiate their hellish passions. Thus, so far as the Christian villages were concerned, Urmia became a heap of ruins and an area that looked like the scene of 100 volcanoes. This was the hour of jihad, the proclamation of the holy war, and the brute who committed more and blacker crimes believed that he was listed for special favors in his prophet's paradise of sensual pleasures. Ruins of Gulpashan, one of the richest Assyrian towns of Urmia, destroyed prior to the arrival of the mountain Assyrians.